back with your next class. In today's class, we are going to discuss the most advanced species of plant on earth, that is angiosperms, which we commonly call as flowering plants. Okay, so with general characteristics, we will begin the class, and that would be in angiosperms, the seeds are formed inside the fruit and sporophylls are organized into flowers. So all of throughout the chapter, you have got to know that in pteridophytes, some of the species will have some fertile leaves called sporophyll, which will be in cluster, and in gymnosperms also you have come to know that always the sporophyll or fertile leaves, that means the reproductive leaves, will be arranged in cluster, right, forming cones. In angiosperms, the most advanced species of plants, these very sporophylls, they would be rather arranged in the form of flowers. So that's why flower is a specialized reproductive shoot, and angiosperms are commonly known as flowering plants. Alright. Also, other than that, the seeds that would be formed in angiosperms would remain enclosed within a fruit. So these two are the very basic and most important characteristics of angiosperms. Alright. Now, these are flowering plants where ovules are enclosed in the ovary and hence seeds are enclosed in the fruit. Alright. Now, these are the largest group of plants occurring in wide range of habitats. They range in size from tiny, almost microscopic ulfia. Ulfia is the smallest angiosperm, to tall trees of eucalyptus, which can be over 100 meters in height. Angiosperms are of two types on the basis of number of cotyledons or embryonic leaves. Alright. So they can be of two types, dicots and monocots. Di means two and cot means cotyledon. Alright. So dicot means presence of two cotyledons. For example, pea, rose, mustard, etc. Likewise, monocots means presence of one cotyledon, where mono means one, right? So one cotyledon. For example, banana, rice and all the cereal plants, etc. Now, a flower is a modified shoot for reproduction consisting of stamen and carpel. And the stamen and carpel are the male and female sex organs respectively. Alright, so from this point onwards, we are going to discuss the most important thing regarding the angiosperms, that is the reproduction or the life cycle pattern of angiosperms. So let us discuss that here in details. All of you should be very careful regarding what we are going to discuss now, because it's very important not only for class 11 but in class 12 as well. You will get an extension to this particular topic. Alright, so let us discuss the life cycle pattern or reproduction in angiosperms in details. Alright, so we'll start with flower. You have learned regarding the flower and its morphology in details in the morphology chapter already, right? So I don't have to make you again accustomed with the structure of the flower. You already know its parts, isn't it? Right? So in a typical flower, you know that the stalk of the flower is called pedicel, isn't it? And it ends up into a swollen point that's called the thalamus, isn't it? Also we can call it the receptacle. Right? Now, the thalamus is actually a condensed shoot, alright, where many nodes would be arranged in a hole so that the floral parts will also remain arranged in a hole. Alright, that means in a circular fashion, keeping a common center, right? So, the flower mainly consists of four parts: sepal, petal, stamen, and at the center remains the carpel. Right? So you know very well the structure as well as the function of all these four parts of the flower. To just remind you for a while again, the sepal, which in a whole is called calyx, isn't it? It is the outermost hole present in the flower. It's mostly green in color and it protects the flower in the bud condition. Internal to the sepal remains the petals, which are very bright colored or aromatic, and they are very beautiful, or the most beautiful part of the flower, and they are meant for attracting the pollinating agents. Now coming to the most essential parts of the flower would be the stamen and the carpel. The stamen is the male reproductive unit present in the flower, and the carpel is the female reproductive unit present in the flower, because they are responsible for male and female gamete formation, isn't it? They are going to be producing, the stamen is going to produce the male gamete, whereas the carpel is going to produce the female gamete. Hence, they are essential parts of the flower, right? Whereas sepal and petals would be regarded as non-essential, as because they are not directly associated with gamete formation. Alright, so now let us discuss the structure of stamen and carpel. See, stamen is the male reproductive unit present in the flower, which consists of two parts, filament and anther. Alright, filament and anther. The anther usually possesses two lobes, and each lobe will have two chambers. Alright, each lobe will possess two chambers, and this chamber is called pollen sac. Inside the pollen sac, certain specialized diploid cells called pollen mother cell, they would undergo meiosis, giving rise to haploid, tiny and microscopic haploid cells, that's called the pollen grains. The pollen grains eventually would produce or would contain two male gametes, and they would be essential for fertilization process to occur. Alright, so do remember the structure of stamen then. It consists of filament and anther. Anther usually possesses two lobes, each lobe with two chambers called pollen sac, and inside the chamber, pollen mother cell will undergo meiosis, giving rise to haploid pollen grains. Pollen grains finally would contain the male gametes. Alright. This being said about the stamen, now coming to carpel. Carpel, if we want to see the structure in elaboration, even the carpel consists of three parts: stigma, style and ovary. Stigma is the part of the carpel where the pollen grain can come and lodge, or it can come and get attached to. Alright. Now, further to the stigma remains a narrow filamentous structure that's called the style. Through the style, when the pollen germinates, it gives rise to pollen tube, just like you have learned in gymnosperms. So the pollen tube would run through the style. Alright. And eventually the pollen tube will enter inside the ovary. So ovary consists of ovule or megasporangia. Okay, the ovary would consist of ovule, which is also known as megasporangium. Alright, just like stamen is known as microsporophyll, likewise carpel is known as megasporophyll. You have learned that in gymnosperms already. Ovule is known as megasporangia. Okay, do remember the ovary can be one or can have one chamber, or it can be having many chambers. Okay, so the chamber inside the ovary is known as locule. What is it known as? Locule. Okay, and if the ovary has one locule, we call it unilocular. If it has two locules, we call it bilocular. If it has three locules, we call it trilocular, isn't it? Likewise, there can be many chambers present. You have learned that already in the morphology chapter, isn't it? So now let us see the structure of ovule in details. The structure of ovule you have learned again in morphology chapter. This is simply a revision. In angiosperms, the ovule is mostly anatropous in nature. Anatropous means micropyle is tilted towards the funicle and salazar remains on the opposite side. Okay, like in gymnosperms, the ovule would be orthotropous, whereas in case of angiosperms, mostly it will be anatropous. Alright, so now see, like in gymnosperms, you have learned that the ovule has one integument. It is unitegmic, but in angiosperms, it is bitegmic. So these are the outer and of course inner integument. Right? Now, internal to the integument remains a tissue called nucellus. Okay. Now, a specialized cell of the nucellus called megaspore mother cell, MMC, megaspore mother cell, will undergo meiosis, giving rise to 4 megaspore, tetrad. Okay, 4 megaspores. All right. So, out of the 4 megaspores, 3 will degenerate, only 1 will survive. Okay, similar to the gymnosperms. Now, suppose this is the megaspore that has survived. Okay, eventually this megaspore that survives, it will give rise to a very large sac-like structure which is known as the embryo sac. Now this is something of a special feature of angiosperms, because you know very well in the gymnosperms archegonia used to be present. Embryo sac only develops in angiosperms. Alright, so inside or internal to the integument remains the nucellus, and there lies the embryo sac. How does the embryo sac develops? One of the specialized cell of the nucellus undergoes meiosis, or it will be specialized to form a megaspore mother cell, which will undergo meiosis, giving rise to 4 megaspores, out of which 3 will degenerate and 1 will survive, and that will give rise to this whole well-developed embryo sac of the angiosperms. Alright, so now let us have a look at the structure of embryo sac. A typical embryo sac, let me tell you the orientation. This is, suppose this is the end towards micropyle, this is the end towards salazar. Okay, so towards the salazar, in the embryo sac, 3 haploid cells will be present called antipodals, and towards the micropyle remains 1 egg, and on both the sides of the egg 2 haploid cells called synergids will be present, and egg plus synergid together makes up the egg apparatus. Alright, and in between these are not cells, rather 2 nuclei. These are called polar nuclei. So do remember, all the cells or nuclei present inside the embryo sac, all are going to be haploid because they are products of meiosis. All of them are going to be haploid. Alright, so this is a well developed embryo sac of angiosperms. Towards salazar, 3 antipodals. Towards the micropyle, we have 1 egg and 2 synergids together forming the egg apparatus, and at the center 2 polar nuclei. Sometimes the two polar nuclei might fuse together to form a diploid nucleus, and that's called a secondary nucleus. Alright? The two polar nuclei might fuse to form a diploid nucleus called secondary nucleus. Alright? So this much is clear? Right? So basically what I have told you so far, let us revise it a bit before I tell you further into details. So in angiosperms, being the most advanced species of plants on earth today, for them the sporophylls will remain arranged in the form of a flower. Flower is a specialized reproductive shoot which consists of 4 parts: sepal, petal, stamen and carpel. Out of the 4 parts, stamen is responsible for formation of male gamete, hence it is the male sex organ, whereas carpel is responsible for formation of female gamete. So it is the female reproductive unit of the flower. Okay. Now, stamen consists of a filament and anther. The anther has 2 lobes, and each lobe will have 2 chambers called pollen sac, inside which by meiosis haploid pollen grains will be produced. And each pollen grain will carry 2 male gametes, which will lead to fertilization later on. Alright. For carpel also consists of 3 parts, that is stigma, style and ovary. Stigma is the part where pollen grains will come and attach during fertilization. Style is a narrow filamentous part through which the pollen tube will migrate after the pollen germinates, and there is a globular base present in the carpel, that's called ovary, which is a protective chamber inside which remains the megasporangium or ovule. Alright. Now, the ovule of angiosperms would be mostly anatropous in nature, and it would be bitegmic. It will have 2 integuments. Okay. And inside the integument remains the nucellus. Now, one of the specialized cell of the nucellus will behave as megaspore mother cell, which will undergo meiosis and give rise to 4 megaspores, out of which 3 will degenerate and 1 will survive, and that will give rise to a well-developed embryo sac. Fine. An embryo sac would eventually look like this. It will have an egg apparatus towards micropyle, 3 antipodals towards salazar, and 2 polar nuclei at the center. Each and every cell present in the embryo sac would be haploid. That's it. So all the parts are clear. Now let's see finally how the reproduction would take place. Alright. So see this. Suppose this is the carpel of the angiosperm. Alright. Here a pollen grain comes and attaches at the stigma. The pollen grain comes and lodges at the stigma of the carpel by the help of various types of pollinating agent. Okay. The transfer of pollen grains from the stamen to the stigma of the carpel is called pollination. So by various types of pollinating agents, a pollen grain successfully reaches the stigma of the carpel. Do remember here in gymnosperms you have learned that there is only one type of pollination present, that is anemophily, but in angiosperms there can be various types of pollinating agents present or pollination present. The pollination may occur by wind, it may occur by water, it may occur by insects, etc. Alright. So eventually as the pollen grain lodges onto the stigma of a carpel, the pollen grain would germinate. Okay. When a pollen grain germinates, it gives rise to a tube-like structure like this. And this is called the pollen tube. Okay. The pollen tube starts migrating towards the micropyle of the ovule. Okay. When the pollen germinates, pollen tube comes out, the pollen tube starts migrating towards the micropyle of the ovule. Okay, that's because the micropyle will start releasing some chemicals which can be sensed by the pollen tube. That's how the pollen tube is guided towards the micropyle of the ovule. Alright, and also throughout the process, the pollen tube will carry two haploid male gametes towards the micropyle. So pollen tube is carrying two male gametes towards the micropyle. So as soon as, suppose this is the ovule, this is the well-developed embryo sac. So as soon as the pollen tube reaches the micropyle, it penetrates the micropyle, okay, and then it enters inside the embryo sac. It penetrates inside the micropyle and also it pushes itself inside the embryo sac. Once inside the embryo sac, the pollen tube would rupture or it will burst, giving out or releasing the two male gametes inside the embryo sac. Alright. So now finally what will happen, you see, when the two male gametes are released inside the embryo sac, one of the male gamete will fuse with the egg. Okay, one of the male gamete will fuse with the egg, forming a diploid zygote, whereas the other male gamete, one male gamete will fuse with the egg, forming a zygote. The two synergids will degenerate by that time. Okay, by the time zygote is formed, the two synergids will degenerate. Now the other male gamete, like in gymnosperms also you have learned, two male gametes were released, one will fuse with the egg and the other will degenerate, right? But here the other will not degenerate. The other male gamete will fuse with these two polar nuclei. And when the one male gamete and two polar nuclei, three of them when they fuse, a triploid structure, 3N structure will be formed, and this 3N structure, triploid structure, is called PEN, primary endosperm nucleus. Okay, so fusion of one male gamete with the egg is happening, right, forming a zygote, and fusion of another male gamete is happening with the two polar nuclei, forming a triploid structure called PEN. Okay, so do remember, this is very, very, very important. When one male gamete fuses with the egg, forming a zygote, we call this event to be syngamy. What do we call it? Syngamy. Okay. And when another male gamete fuses with the two polar nuclei, forming a triploid structure, we will call it triple fusion. This phenomena is called triple fusion. And syngamy plus triple fusion together is known as double fertilization. So double fertilization is the most appropriate or most important characteristics of angiosperms, not found in any other type of plants. Alright? Understood? Fine. So one of the male gamete will fuse with the egg, forming a zygote, that's syngamy. Another male gamete fuses with the two polar nuclei, forming a triploid pen, and that's called triple fusion. Together, syngamy and triple fusion is called double fertilization, which is the most important characteristics of angiosperms. Fine. So at last, after triple fusion or after double fertilization is completed, the zygote eventually will develop into an embryo, alright, and pen will develop into a endosperm. So do remember, in angiosperms, the endosperm, that is the food-laden tissue or nourishing tissue, right? So the endosperm in the angiosperms will be triploid, unlike in gymnosperm. Like in gymnosperm, you know the endosperm is haploid. In angiosperms, the endosperm is going to be triploid. Okay, so finally the zygote will develop into embryo, pen will develop into a triploid endosperm, ovule will convert into a seed, and ovary will convert into a fruit. Is that clear? Fine. So what's happening finally after fertilization? Zygote develops into embryo. Pen develops into endosperm, which is triploid. Fine. Ovule will convert into a seed and ovary will convert into a fruit. That's how in the angiosperms, the seed remains enclosed within a fruit, which is not present in the gymnosperms. Alright, so this is the entire life cycle pattern of angiosperms. I hope all of you are clear about it. So next let us discuss economical importance or the flow diagram for the life cycle of angiosperms. So now for the last part of angiosperms, where we learn about the economical importance and the life cycle pattern. So for economical importance, I think all of you know there are innumerable benefits that we get from the angiosperms. If you look all around you, you would see various substances which are related to angiosperms, isn't it? So to tell you something that is economical importance as such, there is nothing as such. All of you know, it's very obvious for you to identify that what are the kind of benefits that we can gain from angiosperm, right? But even after that, I've listed a few of the categories here, like food. Most of our food, like sources like fruits, vegetables, cereals, etc., all come from the angiosperms. Edible oil like groundnut, coconut, mustard, etc., that also is obtained from the angiosperms. Spices like coriander, cloves, black pepper, and all of that you can think of comes from the angiosperms. Beverages like tea, coffee, cocoa, etc., all of that would be obtained from angiosperms. Medicines like quinine, belladonna, ashwagandha, these are all medicinal plants. Timber like teak, oak, shisham, sandalwood, etc., are all angiosperms. Likewise, fibers, the most common being cotton, is also angiosperm, right? So that's why I was telling you there are innumerable benefits that you can gain from an angiosperm, and our life is directly or indirectly associated or related or completely dependent on the presence of the angiosperms. And finally, for this life cycle pattern of angiosperms, you know very well, in gymnosperm and angiosperm, the gametophytic generation or gametophytic plant body do not have any free living existence. So in that case, the life cycle pattern is diplontic. Okay, the main plant body being diploid sporophytic. Gametophytic generation is for a very brief amount of time, or else it does not have any free living existence. That's why do remember gymnosperm and angiosperm both have diplontic life cycle. Alright, so see here, it starts with a diploid sporophytic plant body which will eventually bear a flower during reproductive phase. The flower would bear stamen, the male reproductive unit, and carpel, that is the female reproductive unit. Stamen would have anther and carpel will have a ovary. The anther would eventually contain the pollen sac, which we also call as microsporangia, and the ovary would possess ovule, that's called megasporangia. Alright. The pollen sac would contain the microspore mother cell, and the ovule will contain the megaspore mother cell. Alright. Now, meiosis would take place among them. Here, meiosis would take place, and that's why the gametophytic generation would begin. That means haploid cells will be formed in the life cycle. As of now, all were diploid. Okay. Now that meiosis takes place, haploid cells will be born. Now, the microspore mother cell undergoes meiosis to give rise to microspores or pollen grains. Megaspore mother cell, on the other hand, would undergo meiosis, giving rise to megaspore, 4 megaspores, out of which 3 will degenerate and 1 will survive, and that would eventually give rise to a well-developed haploid embryo sac, right? Now, the pollen grain will contain the male gametes, and the embryo sac would bear the female gamete, that is egg. Alright. So male and the female gamete will fuse together, that is syngamy, and cause, or due to fertilization taking place, a diploid zygote would eventually be formed. The zygote would develop into embryo, and the embryo will again give rise to a sporophyte. So this is the life cycle pattern of angiosperms finally. So all of you, I hope you are very clear about this chapter, because now we have reached the last part of the chapter in which we are to discuss the life cycle pattern of various categories of plants. I've already discussed that with you in each and every section separately. Now in unison we have to just discuss it in the next class. So with that, I complete today's class for you. I hope all of you are clear about it.